And welcome to the first Hamilton Wealth Partners Thought Leaders webinar for 2021. I'm Will Hamilton. I'm going to start just with our normal general advice warning. So the information contained in this webinar has been provided as general advice only. The contents have been prepared without taking into account your objectives, financial situation or needs. You should therefore, before you make any decisions regarding any information, strategies or products mentioned in this webinar, consult your advisor to consider whether that's appropriate, having regard to your objectives, financial situation and needs. We're thrilled to have with us this afternoon Mark Crosby. We've actually got a student that he's taught from Monash University, and there's actually a few in the audience from Melbourne Business School as well. Mark is recognised as a leading authority in China. It is interesting that the first function we held for 2020 was with Jeff Raby on China. And the first function we're holding, or webinar we're holding in 2021, is again with Mark, but is again on China. And I suppose the question we have to ask is, has a lot changed or has nothing changed? But China would be considered, when you talk to many people out there in the investment community, as one of the top three issues, if not the top issue that Australia has to confront at this point in time. There's been the well-publicised trade disputes, be it the barley, be it wine, forestry, coal, just to name a few. And these are the things that we're confronting at this point in time. In talking to Mark, he just doesn't want to talk about the what, as in the things I just mentioned and the trade dispute, so to speak, but also the why and providing that background. And I think that's really important. So enough from me. Welcome, Mark. And just as at the end, we're going to hold question and answers. So just remember the Q&A buttons at the bottom of the screen. So thank you, Mark, and welcome.
Thanks, Will, and good afternoon, everybody. As Will said, I'm a professor at Monash University, where I've been for the last 4 years, and for 15 odd years before that, I was at Melbourne University, Melbourne Business School. Just in terms of my background and interest in China, I started going to Hong Kong as a research fellow in 2000, working at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And interestingly, at that time, in Hong Kong, of course, there was a great deal of interest in China and its rise. And in particular, at that time, a great deal of interest in China's WTO accession, which gave China the right to more favourable trade relationships with Europe and the United States from 2002 onwards. But also, there's a great deal of interest in how China's rise would affect economies in the region more broadly. I went back to Hong Kong 3 or 4 times over the subsequent 3 or 4 years and learned more about China's economy. But also, while I was with Melbourne Business School, I visited China, I've counted on my passport, more than 50 times over the period from about 2002 to today, mostly with students and running student visits where they would do live cases with companies looking at the opportunities in China. And for me, this was a fantastic opportunity to learn about how Australian businesses had opportunities in China, but also many challenges in doing business in China, and in going to meetings with a vast number of companies and organisations. I feel like I learned a great deal about the business environment. So having not lived in China, I would characterise myself as someone with a very broad understanding of the Chinese business environment, without having the sort of depth that someone who'd worked in finance or something like that would have, who's lived and worked in China. But nonetheless, I think that also gives me a good perspective on understanding the Chinese business and investment environment. One of the main things I think I've learned in my visits to China and in trying to understand the business and the economic and the political environment is that it's extremely important to understand the history of China in order to figure out what's really going on. And because politics is so important to business, the understanding the history of the political systems and so on is very important. So for a lot of my talk today, that's what I'm going to focus on. And in fact, you know, in our current environment in Australia, what happens with this environment politically is critical to business success in China. So I'm going to try and give you a flavour for why we're seeing what we're seeing currently in China with all the tensions that are arising. And the bottom line is it's the philosophy of Xi Jinping that is causing all the troubles that we're seeing. I don't think this is going to go away. I think it's still possible to manage and do well out of the Chinese business environment, but it's going to be a lot trickier than it was 4 or 5 or 10 years ago. I'm not going to go through the whole sort of history or recent couple of hundred years of Chinese history, but I'll just give you a flavour in a few slides for why it is important to understand China's history in understanding the business environment. The British, of course, tried to get into business in China in the 18th century, and there was a very famous delegation. You see one of the caricatures of that on the left on the slide here. A very famous delegation that King George II sent to China to try and open up China to trade with the UK. And Qianlong was the emperor at that time. And there's some very interesting letters that he wrote back to King George II, basically saying, firstly, we're not interested in your things. And secondly, it was very clear that he was very offended by the behaviour of George II's envoy, Macartney, who refused to kowtow before the emperor, refused to do the traditional kowtow. And there's a quote there from Qianlong: "When foreigners come seeking audience with me and are sincere and submissive," and I think the word submissive there is very illuminating, "then I treat them with kindness." And clearly that's what we're being asked today, to submit to the will of Xi Jinping with regard to these 14 demands. Interestingly, the insularity of the Chinese emperor was very important to what then became China's 100 years of humiliation, beginning with the Opium Wars in the 1830s and beyond. A lot has been written about China's 100 years of humiliation. In terms of China's perception of itself, is very much because in the Chinese emperor's mindset, and to some extent the Chinese people as well, China was the center of the world. We call China China after the porcelain China, but the Chinese word for China is Zhongguo. Zhongguo means middle country and the middle kingdom, as we sometimes call China. And in the Chinese emperor's perception of himself, he is the emperor of the central country in the universe. The Chinese word for Japan is Zheben, is rising sun, and that's where we get that phrase for Japan from. So in that region of the world, China was the central and dominant country, and other countries were expected to be sincere and submissive before the Chinese emperor and the Chinese government. And there was this expectation where there was no conception in the Chinese mind of West and East. It was very much central countries, near neighbours, and then we were regarded as barbarians, not as as distant neighbours, but just as people with no culture or anything of interest to China. So these 100 years of humiliation, beginning with the Opium Wars, were very much about China being dominated by countries that it felt very superior to. So very humiliating for the Chinese government at that time. I'll skip now to Mao taking power in 1945 and the Chinese Communist Party taking power. And we traditionally think of this as a communist revolution, but I think China, like Vietnam, it was probably more about anti-colonialist, anti-Western, anti-foreign in short, as much as it was a communist revolution. Mao was determined to return China to much more Chinese ways, to get foreigners out of China and to build their own country in their own way. So you sort of saw that very early on in the communist period under Mao, less so in the last 20 or 30 years. So certainly young people, even still today, but young people are very attracted now to Western culture and genes and music and Taiwanese and Korean music and pop culture and so on. But she's trying to swing that back to a view that Chinese culture is superior. And again, very anti-Western sentiment. There's a blogger pictured on the right there who blogs prominently about or the corruption and so on in Western culture. And she has been supportive of this type of blogger in the past. So there's interesting sort of themes there that have ebbed and flowed, but Mao was very anti-Western and Xi Jinping is very much about rebuilding Chinese culture, the Chinese dream as he's called it. So Mao died in 1976, and the next era that's worth considering in terms of history is the era of Deng Xiaoping. And this is, if you like, the time where China re-engaged with the West. Deng took some early visits to Singapore, where he spoke to Lee Kuan Yew, the Singaporean leader at that time, very impressed by the Singaporean economy and how well it was doing. And essentially followed the Singapore model with the state-owned enterprises and the special economic zones in China through the period of the 1980s and 1990s. Deng gradually opened up markets, gradually opened up to private enterprise. He's famous for a number of quotes. The one there that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice is very much about it doesn't matter whether we have sort of traditional socialist businesses or more market enterprise, as long as they work and as long as they make people wealthy, and to be wealthy is glorious is another saying attributed to him. So the period from 79 to 97 when Deng was leader was very much about opening up to private enterprise. In 1992, the constitution was changed so that China became market socialist, not just socialist. Very important in the Chinese constitution that the word market and openness to markets was formally recognized. And you saw opening up to the West with trade and other forms of people-to-people exchange and so on. So the Deng period was a period where there was this openness to the West and that was broadly across the economy and society. After Deng and prior to Xi, we had two different leaders. But in terms of the themes, the reforms that Deng started continued to be pro-market, pro-entrepreneurship, open to international trade, and particularly with the WTO accession, which sort of took effect from 2002. Reform was never linear in China. So another quote of Deng's is, crossing the river while feeling the stones under the feet. Making reform very carefully, and if things don't work, retreating. So I guess what I would always have said, what I always said to my students when we were visiting China is, with the economy, don't expect reforms to continue to liberalize the economy. Over time, the economy in general will be liberalized, but sometimes there'll be steps back. And the other thing I said through this period was the same is true of politics. If you don't like China's human rights and so on, I think it's getting better. Information control was less through this period over the years. As a regular visitor to China, I would see black screens on the TV as things were censored. But over that period, I'd see less and less stories being censored. And in fact, I remember when Zhao Ziyang, a famous Chinese leader who was banished after Tiananmen, when he died, that was the first time in a number of years I'd seen black screens. So in general, you saw progress in terms of the economic liberalization as well as political liberalization. By the end of this period, it's said in China that the private sector accounted for 60% of GDP, 70% of innovation, 80% of urban employment, and 90% of new jobs in China. Very, very clear that the private sector was now dominant, and state-owned enterprises are seen as sort of lumbering, not so innovative, and not so important in terms of creating jobs. In fact, they're generally sort of shedding jobs through much of this period as they try to become more efficient, in some cases list and so on. Alrighty, so then we get to today, and we're with Xi Jinping, who came to power in 2013. And Xi has really taken a step back from those policies changes that we saw over the last 30 odd years in China. Firstly, he's very fearful of the power of private organizations. And so he's done a few things to sort of reverse progress in terms of liberalization with the private sector. And the most recent thing he's done is put the party into firms. So every party, and there's rules around this, but every large private firm must have a party committee inside the organization with some input into human resources decisions and other decisions of the company. So they're still putting structure around how this will work. They reformed the state-owned enterprises in the same sort of way so that the state-owned enterprises were more clearly aligned with the strategies of the government. But in large private sector firms, they're having to be answerable to the party. And, you know, there's been this question in Australia about the nature of Chinese companies. Well, now quite clearly, you need to understand that any major Chinese company, including the ones in the picture here, will have input from a party committee that's part of the organisation and structured as part of the organisation. And as I say, exactly how that's put in place is still part of the legislative process in China. But that's a very, very important change. You know, the reason why the Ant listing involving Jack Ma didn't go ahead was very much about Xi's desire to put his foot on companies that thought they were too big and control. So even though that was clearly very damaging, I think, to China's reputation, Xi doesn't care. He cares more about the party and more about the control of the party. The other, I think, most important policy we're seeing now in China as well is what Xi has called dual circulation. And I forget the logic of that is a bit peculiar, but the point of dual circulation is to have an economy that is more driven internally. And so, you know, I think what we're seeing with things like wine in particular is China does have an emerging wine industry. And of course, it's, you know, it's not really very important structurally to the economy. So there'll be lots of sectors where Xi and the leadership will make policies that are very much designed to grow internal capability on the production side and lessen reliability on external markets. So Australia's copped some of this because of some of the things our government has done, but we would be copping this anyway because of this dual circulation policy. With iron ore, you know, China's trying to develop its own sources of iron ore in Africa and so on. So, you know, I think we've got a window of opportunity at the moment, but that window will slowly close as other opportunities open up. China definitely has a policy of basically more autarky, more providing for itself. Despite that fact, you know, 2020 was really interesting in terms of China being able to grow despite coronavirus, but the growth was all about exports and investment. So the extent to which this dual circulation policy will be successful, I think, is very open to question. And the extent to which the other policies of Xi, the party in the corporates, will be successful. The government has not been good at innovating and having innovation, driving innovation. So I think it remains to be seen whether these policies are damaging to the economy, and I would be extremely concerned that they will be. That they just won't be able to revolve the economy into a more consumption and investment-driven economy very easily, I think. The other thing to note about Xi's policies is there's a policy called the China Dream, or a values-driven approach called the China Dream. But his policies are very nationalistic, very much about patriotism, and very much about not worshipping money, hedonism, or individualism. So this is an interesting one because I've got a picture in a moment of the most senior policy-making group in China, which is very, it's not white because it's Chinese, but it's all men, all of a similar age. And they have particular values that are very different to young people in China. And it'd be interesting to see whether this creates some problems. The picture that I've got there is of I think it's a Korean or a Taiwanese soap, very popular soap. And the Chinese censors have given the woman with the pink hair a particular watermelon hat there so that she can't be seen as being too individualistic. There's some very funny shows where men with earrings have their earrings pixelated. In fact, as a bit of a joke, you can buy these earrings, which are just pixelated earrings in China because young people find this kind of amusing. But it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. It's very hard to know what Chinese individual sentiment is because they're so worried about offending the party. So it's hard to know how much this is upsetting the younger generation. But there's very much this attempt to return China to more Chinese values and Chinese ways, which is another interesting facet of what's going on in China. So let's sort of come to this and how this relates to Australia and Australian businesses. I think I've just got a couple more slides before we go to questions. Of course, the business community has been upset with the government in some areas and sort of blaming our government for causing some of the problems we're seeing with the Chinese government. I mean, I think the government didn't need to initiate the coronavirus inquiry, but I don't think it was an entirely stupid thing for someone to have done. You know, in terms of the other 14 demands, they're things like not raising issues with the Uyghurs and with Hong Kong and with Tibet. And I guess we have to make a choice now about whether we are willing to submit to China's will in that regard and these other regards in terms of the 14 demands, or whether we continue to voice our concerns. And I would be very concerned if we didn't voice our concerns in terms of human rights and so on. All of this has been very complicated because of the fact that Trump has very much gone his own way. And obviously China's been able to sort of pick off countries somewhat separately, and Canada's been a target. Some European countries have been a target of China's wrath. We feel like we've been particularly targeted, but think about why that's the case. We have a very large share of our trade that is with China. We have a very large trade surplus with China, and there are very few countries in those two categories. So we're just very dependent on China's trade. And in China, they can characterize us as being lackeys to the United States. And again, in terms of the nationalist Chinese media, we're a very easy sort of target. So I don't think this particular bullying, I would call it, from China is going to go away. I just think we need to build coalitions to push back in terms of Chinese demands. And I think under the Biden administration, that should be a lot easier. So Joe Biden has known Xi Jinping for many years and has had some dealings with him. I guess you might think that Biden would be a soft touch, but I think in China, the view would be that they would have hoped that Trump would have won because it was so chaotic and he wasn't building international coalitions. I think China would be well aware that Biden will be building international coalitions. I think the trade issues will become very difficult for China. We're going to the WTO over Bali, and I think we should win that case, but it'll take some time. And the EU and the US are by far the biggest, most important countries to China in terms of China's trade surplus. So as long as the EU and the US pull together and push back on China, they have a lot of leverage, and they can afford it, and we can afford to sort of go along with this to push back against China in terms of human rights and other issues. So there are some interesting deals being negotiated at the moment that are quite contentious. And the EU is considering how much to give to China in terms of trade and so on. And I guess I'm hopeful that they'll be putting pressure on China to back down, basically. But we'll see what happens. But I'm optimistic that that Biden will put pressure on China, and then it will be interesting to see which way China goes, whether they back down or whether they disengage from the international community. I think there'll be a bit of both, but we'll see sort of to what extent we get one or the other. So this is the last slide that I have before we jump to questions. As I mentioned, it's very hard to know how much sort of disillusionment or dissent there is within China because of the information control and so on. You know, we saw with coronavirus, the Dr. Li Wenliang, who was the doctor who sort of blew the whistle on coronavirus and then died very early on. In fact, just over a year ago, it was a year in the last week or so. Died. You know, he said, he was quoted as saying, a healthy society should have more than one voice, which is very clearly critical of Xi Jinping and his very much one voice view of where China should go. I've got a picture on the right there of the Politburo Standing Committee, the most senior group of leaders in China's government from the 10 or 12 years ago and today on the bottom. And this was how the Politburo was depicted in China in 2012. And China does have factions within the government. So there's a faction which tends to be what they call the elitists, and Xi Jinping is in that group. They tend to be sons of previous leaders, have been well educated in the best institutions in China and abroad, and very well connected. And then on the other side, the other faction is, I'm trying to remember what they're called, Tuan Pai in Chinese, but I'm trying to remember how that translates. But they tend to be they're not elitist. They tend to have poorer backgrounds. They will tend to have worked in lesser provinces and so on. There's been in China sort of tacit agreement that the two coalitions or the two factions would have roughly equal power. The elitist group, which is on the bottom in the top slide, and Xi Jinping is on the left, usually has had, or traditionally had 5 seats in the Politburo, and then the other faction had 4. Li Keqiang on the top there is an economist, and he's in that Tuan Pai group. And there was sort of a balance of power there. And you see on the bottom the current Politburo, with Xi Jinping very much in control at the top, only 7 Politburo members, and 5 of those are from his faction, and only 2, Li Keqiang, and I forget who the other one is, but from the other faction. So quite clearly in the last 10 years, Xi has taken control. He's got power for life now with pretty much certainty, and there'll be no dissension or threats to his power, even though these other groups privately might, or these other members of the Politburo in some cases might be quite uncomfortable with that. They're finding it very difficult to push back. So Xi's grab of control in China has been very complete in the last 10 years. And I think that's just going to make it very difficult because of his views in terms of us doing business in China going forward. So where 5 or 10 years ago, I'd have said there's great opportunity in wine and beer and agricultural products and so on, because of our reputation with consumers in China for having these great clean green products. I think going forward, I would be very, very careful about that. I think in some cases, the government will still allow our products to get in. I think the government knows that the mothers in China would be very upset if they couldn't get Australian powdered baby formula. But as I say, in the case of wine, I really think our access to that market will be very limited going forward. So unfortunately for us, this is really difficult. In education, in my field, in tourism, as well as in agriculture and mining, we've been very dependent on China. Think about 20 years ago, how important China was to Australia, and it just wasn't. So we've ridden the China wave over the last 20 years. But unfortunately, that wave is in the process of crashing. And so I think in terms of our political and economic and business engagement, we need to be focusing a lot more on Southeast Asia and India in particular. The regional supply chain initiatives that have been initiated, I think, are a great step. And we really need to sort of focus our energies on that. So there'll be business opportunities in China, but I've always said that it's a challenging place to do business, and it's just going to be more challenging going forward. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to take more questions on the business and economic side, as well as sort of the politics there, that I think gives you the flavour for where we are and where we're going. Thanks, Will.
Great, thanks, Mark. And look, that was fantastic. We actually already have quite a few questions in the Q&A box, so please use that to ask some questions. But I'm going to kick off first. And by the way, I need to apologise. I actually, at the very beginning, I looked distracted. My screen went black, so I was sort of slight panic. One Belt, One Road. You talked before about dual circulation. What sort of role does this have? It's well publicised. We've seen in some countries where it's really been prominent, like Sri Lanka, etc. Is this about the sourcing of external supply, like in Guinea with iron ore? Can you just try and put that in perspective for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's changed in the way the government has talked about One Belt, One Road has changed in the last 5 or 6 years as well. So originally it was very much about reaching out to markets, supporting near economies with infrastructure and so on, and helping support Chinese external trade as well as internal trade. But I think it's morphed into much more being about sourcing of the resources that China can't get internally as part of this dual circulation strategy. So yeah, very much about the Guaidar port in Pakistan and the Sri Lankan port, which would be access for resources and other trade with Africa. Very much so.
Okay, Peter's asked, do you have a view around the inevitability of reunification of Taiwan into China and timing?
So, I mean, formally, the government's policy is by 2049, China is supposed to be reunified, which means Taiwan would be part of China. But in terms of sort of formal policy around that, there's not much more detail than that. In most of recent history, the Chinese government has said that there will be a peaceful transition of Taiwan to the rest of the Republic of China. But in recent years, the word peaceful has been dropped out of that, which is on occasion, and that's a bit of a worry. In my reading of the likelihood of China attacking Taiwan, a direct military attack seems unlikely, but other forms of making life difficult for Taiwan, I think, are likely to continue on the Chinese side. And I think from what many people are arguing, that are sort of more expert in the politics of this than I am, Xi would very much like Taiwan to be part of China by the time he leaves power, however that happens, as part of his legacy to reunify China. So, I guess that means he would be thinking about trying to make that happen in the next 10 to 15 years. I don't think there's anything imminent. It's just, I don't think life is going to be very easy for Taiwan. And I can't see China changing its mind about that either. And I also can't see Taiwan convincing China to become more democratic or have a system that's more like Taiwan's, which would be much more acceptable to Taiwanese.
Okay. How do you see the growth of China's, from Marjorie? How do you see the growth of China's military presence and the influence of their reach into the South China Sea?
Yeah, again, I mean, unfortunately, this is an opportunity for Australia, because quite clearly there's a couple of countries, Vietnam in particular, Philippines and Malaysia, who are very much affected by China's grab in the South China Sea. And China's demands have been refuted at the relevant international tribunals, but ignored by China. So, the opportunity for us is to support countries in their demands around the South China Sea being properly respected. But again, I don't see China backing off. So this is going to be a very difficult one for us, to handle. I don't think they're not going to back off from the bases that they're building in the South China Sea and so on. I think we need to support our regional neighbours a lot more to ensure that they have the GDP growth and the jobs that they need, so that they don't require Chinese investment in ports and infrastructure and so on. I think reviving AusAid to a much more regional focus is strategically really important for us, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Andrew's asked a couple of questions. So this is the first one. Some analysts are predicting a military conflict between China and the US is likely within the next 5 years or so. 1, how likely is that scenario? 2, what will be the flashpoint? And 3, does Australia get dragged into the conflict?
I guess I see the likelihood as low. And I just think for both sides, it's too damaging. As much as China seems to be very willing to push the limit, there is a limit. And I think they know how damaging that would be in terms of any kind of military engagement with the US at the moment. Interestingly, even in these recent border skirmishes between China and India, the word seems to be that the Chinese were badly beaten up. In other words, the number of Chinese soldiers that died was much more than the number of Indian soldiers that died. And I think China realizes their standing army is still not as good as it could be. They're not very well educated and trained. Well, and training's all right, but they've got a very large and obviously quite a strong military, but taking on the US, I think it would still be seen as too high a risk. The likely flashpoints, though, would be, as we've already talked about, Taiwan and South China Sea. And then would Australia be dragged in? I mean, we have to make our decisions about when and why and how we're willing to support the US and other regional neighbours if there is a skirmish. And that's, again, for the military strategists, I guess. But I think we would be drawn in, would be my short answer.
This is a very important question, I think, Andrew's next one, which about birth rates in China, and they've dipped again in 2020. So is China facing a Japan-like future?
Yes, so the workforce peaked in 2014. They relaxed the one-child policy a few years ago, and there was a bit of a blip in the birth rate. There was speculation that the birth rate would go up and people would have 2 children, but it hasn't happened. Interestingly, the year after they relaxed the one-child policy was a very auspicious year in the Chinese calendar, so there are a lot of births, but then the birth rate dropped back down. And still, quite clearly, I mean, China probably will finish up with a total fertility rate like Singapore in the low ones, and that means the population is nowhere near sustaining itself. So the population will decline by end of century quite significantly. That has massive workforce implications, obviously strategic implications as well, and so on. In terms of economic performance, as I say, the workforce has peaked. The young workforce peaked some time ago. So China's advantage in manufacturing is really over. And I think the interesting thing is, so I was interested in a clothing store the other day at how much clothing was still produced in China. I was a little bit surprised by that. But China is trying to find ways to mechanize and move manufacturing to the interior provinces. But as an organization that's sourcing products from China, I would be looking for other manufacturing markets. And that's about the number of young people who are working in factories, the wages of people in different countries, and so on. But I mean, for us in education, the number of births peaked in 2000 at about 16 million. It's now down, I think, around 12 million. So 25% decline in our market. 18 years later, 2018 was the peak number of 18-year-olds in China. And that number is going down by 25% over the next sort of decade or so. So as much as we might hope to get more Chinese students if the relationship improved and COVID went away, demographics is going to make that impossible. So our Chinese market in terms of students is going to decline 2 or 3% a year naturally, irrespective. The only way we can reverse that is to increase market share or the attractiveness of our sector. Same thing with, probably less so with tourism. Demographics is relevant, I guess.
Alice has asked, outside of the military concern, why does Australia care about how China does treat Taiwan?
I mean, I guess, it's the same question about Tibet or Hong Kong. But, the greater the Chinese sphere of influence, the more difficult I think life becomes for us. And there's a view that China hasn't in the past sort of been acquisitive in terms of external aggression. I don't think that's really true. I mean, China traditionally has been invaded and colonized Vietnam, Korea, some other parts of the sort of western regions of China as well. So China's history in terms of external aggression is not as clear-cut as many people say. I don't think it's likely that, as I say, that China's going to militarily engage with the US or with Australia, but I think the more countries we can bring into our sphere, the better.
There's been a little bit written on the fact that we're concentrating very much on, with respect to the trade disputes, about what Australia is going through, and naturally, because that's what we're experiencing firsthand. This has also been felt by other countries as well, such as Canada and the UK. Can you sort of put into perspective what's happening with us versus other major developed nation countries out there as well?
Yeah, I mean, so Canada was sort of initiated by the arrest and the attempt to extradite the senior Huawei executive to the United States. So the woman involved, a Chinese woman involved, was held in China for some time, and I forget where she is now, whether she's back in China or been extradited. I don't think she's been extradited. But that led in China to the arrest of 2 executives who are still in jail. So very aggressive there, and my kids happen to hold a Canadian passports, and my son was supposed to go to China last year, and I said, well, don't take your Canadian passport. So the risks are pretty low, but certainly, Canada has been targeted in different ways, but I think it's just inevitable that if they peeve China, they're going to get sort of different forms of trade retaliation on lumber and so on to what we have. But in some sense, it's not that different. Canada's not quite as reliant on China as we are, so they're not as easily able to be bullied, but they're still quite reliant in the resources sector on China. The UK, of course, is in a different boat because the UK and Europe don't have trade surpluses with China. So if China pushes them around, the sanctions are going to work against China. So I think that, again, that's where Australia is a bit more vulnerable, and it's a bit easier for China to bully us because we're very dependent on China. So, but, forms of retaliation from China have been quite different, but I'm trying to remember what country, I think it was Norway. They had very similar forms of retaliation when they supported the Dalai Lama with bans on smoked salmon and salmon fish trade, basically. So different forms of action against different countries, but still, basically actions that don't go through legal systems or the World Trade Organization or international forums. They're quite arbitrary, and that makes it very difficult to sort of handle those actions by China.
Laura's asked, foreign investment has had a very large direct and indirect impact on the Australian economy and in particular real estate markets. How do you see this moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, a really interesting one. And there's immigration, and then there's students as well. So, Melbourne CBD and Sydney CBD, the amount of student housing is very significant. And there's still a very strong demand. If you look at consumer preferences and the preferences of parents in China for foreign education, it's still very strong. But again, I think that in terms of values, the Chinese government will be trying to tilt that. So I think we'll see less Chinese students going overseas in the future from as opposed to what we've seen in the past. Obviously, COVID's put a huge dent in that naturally anyway. And Australia's share of that market, even if it holds firm, will mean declining numbers from students. So therefore, declining demand for apartments in particular and other forms of real estate. The immigrant-driven and the other demand from China for real estate, I think is still there. Again, with COVID, it's sort of hard to see it completely. But there are a lot of people in China who don't like the political system and want to have access to another country. So there's still going to be the demands for immigration, but on our side, whether we have the same numbers and therefore the same demand for real estate, I think is very questionable. So yeah, obviously at the moment, the low interest rates are driving property market prices, but there's clearly oversupply in apartment markets, particularly around student housing. So I think that one might be a bit challenging going forward.
Andrew's asked, if you were advising the Prime Minister, how can we fix the relationship with China? Should we even try?
I mean, we've got to try. And, trade is not going to go away completely. It's just, as I say, a lot more difficult than it was. We've got to try. I think the government, after the issue with calling for the coronavirus inquiry, I think the government's been a lot more careful with what it's said, but they also haven't backed down. And as I say, I think it's more about a case for us trying to support, particularly the US and Europe, in building coalitions that basically are of the similar mind to us. And that will be much more effective than us trying to change, the Chinese mind on the Uyghurs or issues like that. The horse has bolted on the coronavirus inquiry. I think we can't undo that. And yeah, so that's our most effective method. But I think the government here has been very civil. Some of the things in terms of the press on the Chinese side have been pretty unsophisticated and unpleasant. We haven't resorted to that, so I think we're doing as good as we can given the environment, I think.
Yeah. The trade war in certain products, especially in some of the grains, it's been very considered and very well timed, and I don't think people quite realise that actually someone who was telling me here who is not on the call today as a participant, was telling me, for instance, with the barley crop, it literally the ban was announced within a week of the crop being sown. Can you just explain just about how, in your opinion, how well considered some of this is on the Chinese part? Also, just put into perspective, we've got, the 72 ships and $1 billion of export in coal just sitting off the coast, the Chinese coast as well. So again, the implications of this, but also how considered this is.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's very considered, and it's considered to do maximum damage, and even the willingness to damage the Chinese economy is there. They could cut iron ore exports, which would obviously be a disaster for us, but they haven't done that because that would be too damaging to China's economy. But the coal is a really interesting one. Obviously, with thermal coal, a lot of it is for private citizens who haven't been able to get heating in parts of China, the central parts of China that are pretty cold. So, I read, I don't know if it's correct or not, but I read that in Zhejiang, just outside Shanghai, people weren't allowed to turn on their heating until it got below 3 degrees because of the lack of thermal coal. So, yeah, the willingness, and again, from a strategic perspective, what do you do if you want to cause maximum harm at minimum cost? You figure out how to be strategic about how and when you attack our markets. So if I was our government, I would be thinking about what's the list of products that China's going to ban, when are they going to do it, what's the order, when do other countries sort of come into the mix as well. But quite clearly, they're not talking to us at the moment, so I don't think we've seen anything near the end of these issues.
Look, that's it. Thank you very much, Mark. Very much appreciated, and the effort you went to. I know these things are a lot of work, and we appreciate not just the slide deck as well, which you did say we are able to share. So I'll have that put up on the website. So thank you, and thank you very much for everyone for attending. So look, again, Mark, very insightful, and we appreciate it enormously. Thank you.
Thanks, Will.
Okay. Goodbye.